everybody able to see that? I hope so. Um, all right, well, to get started, uh, I'd like to say, first of all, thank you for joining my talk. My name is Michael Galloway, and I'm a senior engineering manager at Netflix. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the unique culture, engineering culture actually, at Netflix and the journey we took to achieve it. My hope is that some of the lessons that we learned along the way may prove useful as guidance for you as you look to evolve your engineering culture. So just before we get started, I thought we might do a little bit of introductions. So first, like I mentioned, senior engineering manager at Netflix. I've been at Netflix for over 4 years. I work on the platform organization specifically on delivery engineering. Platform is responsible for providing tools and services that the rest of engineering leverages. And one of the key platforms for continuous delivery at Netflix is Spinnaker. It's a product that my team works on and one that Netflix, along with Google, open sourced in 2015. A popular company in Israel that, of course, uses Spinnaker is Waze. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. And more recently, we donated Spinnaker to the Continuous Delivery Foundation. I also sit as a board member on the Continuous Delivery Foundation as well. And so there's also projects like Jenkins, Jenkins X, and many others. Hopefully, many of you are familiar with Netflix. We're a global streaming entertainment company, accessible in virtually every country in the world. We've been around for about 22 years, actually starting as a mail-based DVD company. It wasn't until 2007 that we started streaming content. About 4 years after that, we started making original content and then began to increasingly invest in local original content, some of which I hope you are all very familiar with. We're fortunate to be able to partner with some of the best talent around the world and tell regional stories on a global scale. So you may have heard about the culture of Netflix. We do have a pretty unique culture and one that's evolved over the years. And I believe the story I'm about to share with you today very much relied on aspects of our culture, but also reinforced our values. One of the most well-known values in our culture is freedom and responsibility. And I know you're thinking, what does that exactly mean? Does it actually mean that engineers have access to production systems? Yes. Does it mean that every engineer has the ability to see all the source code? Yes. Can a new engineer that just joined the company accidentally cause an outage of the entire service? Yes. In fact, we used to celebrate that moment and almost as a rite of passage. There's a lot of reasons why we did this. But I really think it boils down to a matter of building a culture based on just a few key principles. So we believe that employees should be encouraged to make decisions independently. That doesn't mean you go off and you just build random services or features that are unimportant. Hopefully we've done the second item on this list correctly and we've provided you the right context you need in order to make the right decisions. We don't keep information in silos. In fact, we're extraordinarily transparent with nearly all information. Literally, we share business information throughout the company. It's accessible for people to see aspects of our production, details, behind the scenes information. You'd be amazed at how much is actually available to everybody in the company, because we believe it's vital that people in a position to take action, including engineering, are armed with the right information to make the right decisions. So what happens when things go wrong? Well, we have a strong feedback culture. We believe that you need to know where your perceived strengths and weaknesses are. Those are not to tear you down, but rather to build you up and help you out. Netflix hires slowly and deliberately, and so anyone that's unsuccessful is a big loss for us. But in the end, we do strive to create a high-performance culture with the most talented individuals. And we do try to avoid rules, people over process, as the agile philosophy states. These are aspects of our culture that reinforce and rely on each other. And they also fuel nimbleness, flexibility, and execution. So behind all of the Hollywood production level work is our technology. We've built a global distributed content delivering system, advanced streaming technology to support thousands of devices, both mobile and wired. And we've developed new encoding technologies that we can enable us to re-encode our entire catalog with every new update. We deliver software to production services multiple times a day across our entire engineering organization. Every single day, we improve our product. We are able to do this because we have an engineering culture that follows the full cycle developer model. All right, so what is a full cycle developer? So in short, it means you operate what you build. Now, in most cases, this might seem crazy, but we actually don't have a central team for operations, support, or QA. The responsibility to do all of that falls on every engineering team to handle. So the belief there is that engineers that built the application best understand how to operate and support it. And that by not throwing things over the fence, engineers are forced to feel the impact of bad design and flaky code. As an anecdote, when I first joined Netflix, there literally was applications that were still being rebooted on a daily basis with a little script. And the engineering culture at Netflix shifted to address that by making it such that the application owners were the ones that actually saw and felt that pain. And so this operational and support burden gave valuable insights to application owners and forced them to deal with the limitations of their application, which results in higher reliability and availability because now they're incentivized to address those problems. So that's all well and good, but how the heck do we get there? That's the question, right? Netflix didn't start off as a full cycle developer company. We became that. And transforming how engineering functions is no small task. So before we dive into the how, let's make sure we agree on what transformation is. It's not about small tactical changes, though it's composed of those. And it's not about changing a team or just an organization. It's about changing the way the business as a whole fundamentally works. And for this presentation, it's about how engineering sought to address the challenges of a new business model as we moved from DVD to streaming. Why is transformation so hard? Transformation is not an uncommon endeavor for companies to undertake. Virtually every major company has attempted them at multiple times throughout their history, and many of them fail. Netflix has a lot of the examples of this. We have plenty of doozies like everybody else does. So transformation is hard. Why are ideas, even great ones, seeming with clear business value, so hard to gain broad adoption? Approaches from top-down mandates or sales campaigns within the company, large company discussions and hundreds of small breakouts are all techniques that have mixed results at best and at worst crash and burn. Why? So in the time that I've been at Netflix, I've been able to observe a lot of different transformations. And before I came to Netflix, I observed many others in the other companies that I've worked in. And I've come to the realization that transformations often fail when one or more of the following is lacking. Lack of urgency. There isn't a compelling reason to change, or at least not one that the front lines really feel. When engineering teams don't understand the urgency, they're likely to delay implementing changes, even ones that might be valuable, because everybody is behind on their work. They may have bugs to fix, and they may have features that need finished building. This is really tricky at a place like Netflix, where we have a culture of freedom and responsibility. Where we should go and why, that if there's a lack of vision, people don't get it, or it's hard to communicate. And this is one of the trickiest areas to get right, because it requires that the vision be something simple, clear, and sticky. It needs to speak to the audience in a way that they can apply it to their world, internalize it, and even grow it locally. I'm going to pause here for a minute and mention that this list and my explanations, when I get into the journey that I'm going to explain how we got there, I'm going to see if all of you are paying attention and you can identify each of these pieces as part of the journey and how they actually happened when I get to that story pretty soon. But moving forward, lack of alignment. If key people are not brought into the process, influencers, stakeholders, representative leaders, contributors, when people aren't involved, they have no sense of ownership of the outcome. If they don't have a sense of ownership, then they will at best reluctantly go along and at worst work against the transformation. This isn't because they're nefarious people with ill intent. It's just because they feel dismissed, that their goals and priorities are unimportant. And worse, since no solution or vision is perfect, any hiccups in the rollout will result and all of those unincluded voices raising up and dissenting. I've seen it. If a transformation that's getting pushed forward starts to trip up, all the people that said it wasn't a good idea, it couldn't be done, they surface out of the woodwork, and man, are they eager to point out that they knew all along that we shouldn't have gone that direction. Lack of execution. All too often, teams want to solve too many problems, and so they get mired in debates instead of executing. I have seen many technical evolutions and great ideas descend into long debates and long discussions about what it should be, how it should look, and the direction it should go without ever finding a way to move forward. Determining what is critical to achieve that will yield the minimum demonstrable value, and then focusing on that is vital. Get some wins as soon as possible to validate the approach. And finally, lack of evolution. Every transformation is always flawed from the start. If it were obvious, they'd be done overnight, but they're not obvious. They're hard, which means you need humility, agility, and curiosity. You need those short-term wins and feedback and data to inform the next steps. And then you iterate. You need to evolve with the teams. As you move new ideas out and teams start absorbing them, that's when you'll start to get a sense of the real value that will resonate with them. And that's the key point at which culture starts to shift. And once teams have started really obtaining value and making it their own, then they become case studies that'll resonate with every other team. Okay, I gave you the framework, some of the things to look for. Let's jump into the journey and see if we can start to identify where some of those items that I mentioned will surface in the story. So I'm going to take you back in time. 13 years ago, actually before 13 years ago, Netflix was a DVD company. I don't know how many of you all know that, but we had a traditional data center model, and we operated in a really similar way to most other technology companies. We literally sent out physical DVDs that you would order effectively through our website. It was a rental service, and it was a simple delivery service effectively. Of course, we had a big warehouse of DVDs, and we would ship them out. And you would watch them and you'd ship them back. We'd ship out the next set of DVDs that you wanted. And that was our business. And that was the business for about 9 years, actually, before we started to make some changes. So up until 2007, DVD business, we were like any other company on our engineering side. Development teams handed off implemented work to test teams, who were then responsible for the quality checks. And then when it was ready to deploy, it was handed off to a network operations center to deploy, operate, and support. I think already you can see the throwing things over the fence model that this often encourages. Netflix began streaming video in 2007. And at the same time, we started to shift services to the cloud. A new operating model was then developed. And looking back on it, we call that the hybrid model. And this approach was meant to take advantage of some of the early ideas around DevOps. So we had developers that were also operations people. And in theory, they were asked to build tools to simplify or automate aspects of the operations responsibility. But in practice, they ended up not having as much time to take those actions as they would have liked. We still had, even though we didn't call it a NOC, we called it a central operations team. It effectively still operated very similarly to a NOC. They still held most of their support responsibilities and most of the overall operations duties for the cloud. And so while there were certain improvements over the specialized model, the overall workflow really had many similarities. So this is up until 2011, this is how Netflix software development worked. And as a reminder, at this point, the history of the company, we were mostly still a mail-based DVD company with a small, nascent streaming service, just about 4 years old. The streaming business began to grow steadily, though. And so from the 4 years between 2007 to 2011, we more than tripled our subscriber numbers. And in 2011, we took our first stab at this original series, Lilyhammer. This was a big deal for a company that basically up until now effectively just licensed content from others. But it's really 2012. That's the year that everything changed. Netflix not only released two more major original series, Orange is the New Black and House of Cards, but the business model fundamentally shifted. All of a sudden, we were a streaming entertainment company that produced original content first and a mail-based DVD company second. If you take a look at this chart, you can see how that switch happened, and it's a phenomenal moment in our history. During this time, some of you might recall that we actually briefly attempted to try to split our DVD business and our streaming business. This is why, by sheer percent of income, streaming dominated. At this same time, we were growing at a pace of nearly 1 million new subscribers every month. So for engineering, this meant that streaming issues would have an enormous impact on our business. Keep in mind, for 4 years, streaming was an important part of the business, but it was small. It was a small group of engineers, and they were not the primary source of income for the company. This switched in 2012. And so now there was a clear business urgency around streaming. There's a need to execute faster and more reliably, but unfortunately, we were still operating on our hybrid model, which had a lot of challenges. As I mentioned earlier, the hybrid model was not only dramatically different from a traditional data center, was not dramatically different from a traditional data center. Teams still released on a monthly basis, and those releases were big and coordinated events. And operations and support still worked in a very centralized fashion. So engineering teams in streaming in 2012 formed a rallying cry. We cannot do things the same way we used to. The view was that anything that smelled of the old data center was toxic. But what was the vision? What was a better model than this? And from 2012 to 2014, we investigated that question. So we knew we needed to return to first principles, something like the good old days of a small startup when we were able to move fast. What was it that made that possible? Well, we realized it was about the level of context that engineering teams had. They had to know how to operate their application because they were the only ones that were available to do it. They had to know how to test their application because there was no dedicated test team. The streaming engineering teams were compelled to figure out what worked in this new cloud-based world. And so being a mix of old hat folks from the DVD and data center world and some new engineers, they internally had all the necessary skills locally to build and operate their services. And given our culture of freedom and responsibility, this empowered them to start defining a new way or a new set of best practices around learning and feedback, which was critical for them to learn how best to take advantage of the cloud. So informed by the philosophies behind DevOps, they began to craft the early vision of full cycle developer to operate what you build, to maximize context and learning. This was the vision. But full cycle development isn't a cultural shift alone. It requires the development of tools and services that enable teams to be effective at all stages of the SDLC. I am very confident that if you turn to all of your engineers today and you ask them if they're wonderful at operations and wonderful at deployment and wonderful at testing, they're all going to tell you no. And frankly, no engineer or engineering team is necessarily great at all those things. So we had to figure out a way to address the gaps, to make it possible for engineering teams to be effective. And so what we did is we built services like Atlas for metrics, and we built a tool called Asgard, which was later replaced with Spinnaker for continuous delivery, and Canary analysis for testing and validation of changes. So with each of these services, it was up to the developer to configure them and use them. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that, because I know that a big question is, what did we actually do? So what we did is we did effectively these 3 steps. We prioritized enabling the full build release cycle. So think about this as running towards the first most meaningful win we could get. So we built CI workflows out of Jenkins jobs and used our deployment tool Asgard for testing. And for testing, we documented steps on how to set up a Canary cluster. Literally the entire flow was stuck together with documentation, guides, and scripts when we had to. The point was we wanted to make it possible for an engineering team to go through the entire cycle on their own. And this was the lowest cost way to attempt to deliver that value. So it's worth noting we didn't just build all the tools that we needed. We literally documented and stuck the things together that we had because we wanted to know whether or not it was possible for engineers to actually accomplish this. And so we had to validate that. And so next we tested and we got feedback. We found out what worked and what didn't. And we were able to prove that teams really could do this and that there was actual value to it. And so then we started focusing on building improvements and automation and tooling that enabled us to finally automate that entire CI/CD workflow. And so at this point, though, we were on solid ground because we knew what worked and what didn't. And it was just a matter of improving on what we had already established. This flow, these three stages of execution are how we actually went from the hybrid model to the full cycle developer model. But what's important is I want to emphasize this, it was not about building the tools. Building the tools wasn't the answer. We built the tools to help with continuous delivery monitoring and other challenges even before the full cycle developer concept. AWS even provides some of those out of the box for us. The difference here is that we built tools to enable a vision. They unlocked the ability for teams to operate what they built. That vision informed the experiences that the tools and services needed to provide. They drove us to provide more capabilities and information so that owners could learn and evolve their products. We invested in guardrails and not gates, so owners were free to explore and experiment with as low risk as possible. As an anecdote, we didn't implement any kind of serious authorization system for Spinnaker within Netflix until just actually a few years ago. Even now, virtually any team can redeploy API services for streaming should they want to. They can see how API teams design the pipelines and learn from them. And they can see what kinds of safety features they use, alerts they define, etc. Understanding that you're responsible for your application in production became the reason engineering teams cared about safety mechanisms and delivery best practices. And that has made us better. So we added more shows until Netflix streaming and original content became the dominant form of entertainment for our customers. Our technology continued to scale as we enabling us to reach more than 170 million subscribers worldwide, more than 7 times our size in 2011. It was clear that the advantages of the cultural and technical approach that streaming had pioneered, this full cycle developer, was a superior approach, and so it eventually spread across all the rest of the engineering teams at Netflix. Many of the services built by the streaming organization, later we called Edge, became part of the centralized platform team that the whole of Netflix relies on today. Best practice workflows became paved paths that streamlined the onboarding of new applications and teams. And effectively at this point, the transformation of Netflix into a full cycle developer organization was complete. So before I go to the next slide, just a mental check. I'm curious, as you play back the story, did you identify where some of the key needs for transformation were addressed? Let's see. So, sense of urgency. Basically the why now. The why now in our story is that streaming was the future. It was that rallying cry that streaming must be invested in. This declaration sent a clear tone that we must think differently about what and how we execute as an engineering org, that the inefficiencies of our current model needed to be addressed, and that needed the ability, and that we needed the ability to iterate quickly to achieve the value the company needed from us. There was a realization that we must maximize learning, but also reliability. We needed to be nimble, yet we also knew that we couldn't be a flaky service while we were trying to figure this out. And finally, we had to do it without hiring thousands of new people. This led to the what, or the vision. What if each team operated what they built? What if every engineering team was empowered and responsible for the applications and the improvements they delivered? As experts, they could fix the issues faster, and they would be closer to the operational and support costs to understand where improvements need to be made. Streaming was naturally aligned with this mission, but also key contributors and leaders were brought from the old data center days to help design and build out the initial platform services. By staying focused on streaming, we could test and iterate on our approach quickly. And so we prioritized enabling the workflow first with existing tools and new documentation. We then evolved our basic platform services and added to them and iterated on them to reach full automation. This allowed us to accomplish a key goal, which was to demonstrate that this approach worked. Short-term wins were critical for further investment. We aren't done yet, though. Full cycle developer is not really a milestone or a destination. It's really a way of thinking, rooted in the idea that innovation is unlocked by aligning the practices of engineering with maximizing learning and efficiency. As we look towards the future, though, we've started to think about how we can maximize our developer productivity even further. So I'm about to talk about something that we are working on actively right now, and I'm excited about it because it is something that is specifically an area of focus for my team. The future of Netflix engineering is actually a greater investment in solving problems for engineers. So moving them from a world where they can leverage the best practices and knowledge and know-how developed over the years, where platform teams, central teams, library owners, and engineering teams can evolve software and platforms faster and independently from each other. So the future is about answering the following challenges. As a platform organization, how can we provide a higher level of service to engineers so that they can stay as focused as possible on adding business value? How do we do so in a way that doesn't inhibit their ability to own and operate their application? How can we reduce the cognitive overhead and manual toil that is intrinsic to being responsible for maintaining more and more applications through all aspects of the life cycle? We believe that the answers to these challenges lie in elevating the operational experience to one that is intent-based instead of imperative steps. So imagine describing what your application requires and the necessary infrastructure, service configurations, safety mechanisms, and continuous delivery workflows are all set up and managed for you. And more importantly, those various components could be evolved for you because the system understands your applications and its requirements. So platform changes, libraries, infrastructure improvements can be adopted across the fleet in days instead of weeks or months. That's the future that we're headed towards. So after all this, what are some key takeaways that I hope can maybe help you as you think about your own transformations? So first, this is my recipe for full cycle developer culture. Start with identifying the urgency. What are the reasons you cannot stay the same any longer? How is the current way of operating going to affect your business going forward? And in short, why should people start focusing on this problem right now? Next, connect what being a full cycle developer culture means in the context of the business. Can you truly operate what you build? I want to highlight this one specifically because there is certain elements related to the Netflix culture that I think help support this by that freedom and responsibility aspect. And I'm going to zip through the rest because I realize that I only have a few more minutes left. So I'll just mention that you need to be able to clearly articulate why this model yields benefits, how the feedback loop of operating what you build could change your business. Identify small but representative parts of the organization to begin with. Don't try to do a massive transformation all at once. You need to prove this out and maximize your chances for doing so. And within that organization, you need to make sure the teams have a mix of backgrounds, some with operational knowledge and some with testing knowledge. You don't want specialists. It should be all engineers responsible for writing code. However, you do want a team that shares knowledge and understanding with each other. Next, identify early trial cases. Don't worry about building a bunch of tools. Just create, document, or otherwise just figure out a way to enable those early teams to self-service their entire software cycle. Don't build everything first, just stitch it together. And then as you start to learn, you will start to get feedback on which parts work and which parts don't work. But most importantly, you'll be able to validate that whole flow and you'll be able to get early wins. And finally, evolve. You're going to need to make sure that you take that feedback and you constantly react and respond and evolve, and you build off of each of the wins. Lastly, you'll know when you've got it right when you start hearing people say to newcomers that it's the way we do things. Thank you. Okay, so now I believe it is my turn to take a look at question. So one of the first questions here is, what other companies use full cycle developers? That's a great question. I actually don't have a great answer for you, although I do know that a number of companies that we work with closely, I would say Google being one of them, have many elements that I would say would be considered close to that. Google has invested in some technology that you might be familiar with, such as Borg. It looks like, let's see if I can kill the screen sharing. I apologize. I'm the guinea pig on this one here. Can stop sharing here so folks, I guess, can see me. There we go. All right. So I do know that some companies operate with a more full cycle developer model in some aspects of what they do, but I'm not aware of any companies that are fully adopted in that model. I think there is an element of which our culture has somewhat enabled us to be able to do the things that I think are fundamental to that, such as, like I mentioned earlier, the ability to directly interact with production systems at any point in the company for all engineering. How do you manage and control the cloud costs, and how do you execute it in the teams? This is a great question. So this is the responsibility part of the freedom part. So we actually do care about cloud costs. We have a number of tools that we try to surface to provide information to teams about their current cost utilization. And it is something that, while we don't enforce an amount that they have as a cap, the fact is we aim to provide as much information and context to them. And the way Netflix culture works is, if you are being, I think, a poor steward of the cloud resources, it is something that becomes noticed, and you will be asked questions as to why you are not taking that into account. So that's a little bit of the context aspects, and a little bit of the feedback culture, I suppose, there as well. Are there really no specialists focusing only on design, deploy? If all are generalists, how do they divide their time? So that's great. I would say that I wouldn't say it's an extreme of absolutely no knowledge about these things, but it is actually true. The majority of engineering teams at Netflix don't have a dedicated SDET or testing individual. They don't have a dedicated person for the operations aspects of the product. Application failures, system failures, we have a central team that is aware of the overall cloud situation and supplies feedback to those teams saying, hey, we see a signal over here, or hey, there seems to be something flapping. But it's on the application owner's responsibility to go and solve those problems, and also to have alerts. And if they don't have the alerts, if they got notified by that, what we call core team, they are heavily advised to take these steps necessary to put in the necessary alerts so that they are aware. Every team is responsible. If you have what we call a tier 1 service that can affect streaming, it's expected that you have people on call and available to address problems whenever they surface. Surprisingly, our reliability is extremely high, actually, as a result of that, because it's just the understanding of how we function. Can I please explain the process from the moment you understand you have a problem until it's fixed? So let's actually use an interesting kind of problem. So an incident, for example, a streaming impacting incident. So you, as an application owner, let's say I'm working on a service that is responsible for the license server. So it's a license server receives requests from our devices and obviously to play content. If the license server fails to return back or acknowledge the license, you get, I think, about 10 seconds worth of content before we pick it up and we say, nope, you're not allowed to watch. And so this happens. Let's say that I am one of the engineers responsible on the team that owns the license server, and I make a bad push and my license server fails to provide licenses to customers. If I didn't have alerts to notify me that there was some streaming impact as a result of my push, hopefully I did during the delivery process, because we do have canaries that slowly introduce a new change into a production environment. and can test on these kinds of things. But let's say I failed to get that signal. If I didn't have my alerts properly set up, that I also didn't get that signal, I will get notified, because we do monitor our streams per start. We monitor a bunch of other metrics that tell us how our customers are doing, whether they're experiencing pain. So I will get notified. What then ends up happening is, especially if I'm the one that's on call, I get pulled into a discussion with the core group that is monitoring all of these customer requests that are coming in and the status of our systems. And I am responsible for then going and making sense of the logs, what's going on, and keeping everybody on the same page in effectively a virtual war room, as it is. But at the end of the day, once I've gotten through that, then the core team, that is a very knowledgeable team about incidences, this is the first one I've ever done, will guide me through the process of reviewing the incident, what happened, documenting all of the necessary information, capturing all the facts. And it's not meant as a thing that's pointing fingers. It's meant as a lesson for everybody else to learn, and what are the outcomes, and how could we have caught this sooner? What was missed during the delivery flow that could have captured this? Those kinds of things. I know I didn't get to all the questions. I apologize for that.